In today's video, I'm going to share with you a selection of books that I would recommend for those of you who are looking to learn more about folk witchcraft and traditional witchcraft. So if you're interested to learn about some of these books, then please do keep on watching. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me for today's video. So in today's video, I wanted to share with you some books that I have been reading over the past year or so around the topic of folk witchcraft and traditional witchcraft. And there's a lot to say about what folk witchcraft and what traditional witchcraft is and isn't, and I would like to make a video actually discussing that in more depth, but I will start with a little bit of an explanation before I get into the books. For this video, I'm focusing mostly on European and specifically British folk and traditional witchcraft, although there are fantastic resources that I think of when I consider folk witchcraft or traditional witchcraft in the Americas or in Australia or in other parts of the world. I want to preface this by saying that whilst I've been practicing witchcraft since I was 11 and learning about the craft throughout my teens and as an adult as well, I do not know everything. I am not the only resource you should be watching or listening to. I am one person who has read around these various topics, who has ways in which they do things themselves, and I have one lens that I am viewing everything through. I would never want to say that everything I say here is the be-all and end-all. I want you to go out and do your own research and look at things with a really critical eye, because one of the most vital skills of being a witch is being able to critically think. A lot of the reading is quite dense and hard to get through in general when you're reading around history and these topics, and so I think it's really, really important to have that critical view with which you read and learn and absorb information, and give yourself time to do that as well. So I just want to make that disclaimer, and if you have different opinions, that's absolutely fine as well, and we can all be friends. I'd love to talk about it in the comments box below. Let's just keep it respectful. Essentially, folk witchcraft or folk magic is as it sounds, in that it is the magic of the people. It's the village healer, it's the cunning woman, it is the medicine woman, the wise woman or man who might have been on the edge of the village, you know, and kept themselves away, or may have been known to the community as being someone who heals and who has powers to do that. And many people would go to that person, even people who were part of the church would go to that person. And so there's a lot of rabbit holes that you can go into. I think that learning about folk magic and traditional magic, you end up wanting to learn more about history, and that leads you to looking at occult texts and tomes and lore, as well as reading the work of historian Ronald Hutton, for instance. I've read Witch by Ronald Hutton, which was not an easy book to get through because it is dense and very academic. It is an academic text, but also because of the constant kind of descriptions about how witchcraft, witches were perceived and what they were said to have done in the night, etc. It's not easy to get through a book like that, but it is quite necessary to do so. So I would just preface it by saying that you will start reading around these topics and then you'll want to segue into other areas like history, and even with looking at just sort of folk witchcraft in Britain, you end up getting wrapped up into Wicca as well, because there are ties there. So what traditional witchcraft is sometimes confused with is Wicca, because there's traditional British Wicca, which essentially comes from Gardnerian Wicca. Gerald Gardner started the religion of Wicca, which obviously is not the same as witchcraft, which is a secular practice. The two can come together. They can also be separate. Not all Wiccans are witches, not all witches are Wiccans. Witchcraft can be a spiritual practice and not involve Wicca. Witchcraft can be a secular practice and not involve Wicca. Witchcraft can be a spiritual practice and involve Wicca and be a religion. They're not one and the same, and there's a lot of confusion around that as well. I think that's more broadly known these days, but when I first came into witchcraft, I remember it was in the 90s and there was a lot of conflation between the two. They were considered one and the same by many, and by many authors. Even now, you have to read through the texts and read past the Wicca, which can be frustrating for some people who are not interested in following that path. I personally can read a book from a Wiccan author and glean so much insight and value from that text and just read past the Wicca, but some people don't want to do that. But traditional witchcraft is not exactly anything to do with Wicca specifically, other than traditional witchcraft did again gain some momentum after Wicca had gained some momentum. The reason for this was because of a man called Robert Cochrane, who had known Gerald Gardner, who had known Dorian Valiente, and who had also then resisted and had started to look into older, more archaic practices to create something of a magical practice and a magical witchcraft tradition around something that was separate to Wicca, but that was again popularized after Wicca was popularized. So whilst traditional witchcraft itself is not a religion in the way that Wicca is, there are different strands of traditional witchcraft in a similar way that there is Gardnerian Wicca and there's Alexandrian Wicca, Dianic Wicca, and now eclectic Wicca. Essentially the root of Wicca is Gardnerian Wicca, as Gerald Gardner was the person who brought Wicca into the mainstream, although he may not be the one who penned many of the beautiful writings Dorian Valiente supported him with and was a huge part of creating Wicca, but he was the one that popularized it. And also witchcraft has a lot to thank Wicca for that reason. There's a reason why witchcraft is so popular now, and that is because Wicca brought it back into the mainstream. There is much to learn around the Witchcraft Acts in England. There are many dates where different acts were repealed, and there's just many rabbit holes to go into, and I didn't want to have to get too much into that, but I wanted it to be clear that traditional witchcraft is not governed by a body, even though it was sort of repopularized again by Robert Cochrane, and that also, you know, Wicca had a huge part to play in that. And I do think that reading some books around Wicca can help to support your understanding and knowledge as you learn more about folk witchcraft and traditional witchcraft. I think there is a slight nuance and difference between the two as well, because I think when you talk about traditional witchcraft, you're talking about different traditions of witchcraft perhaps, because there are different traditions of traditional witchcraft, such as Robert Cochrane's tradition, but then there are also much older, archaic ways of practicing witchcraft, which is much more, I think, what I'm interested in, rather than doing a lot of rituals that another person wrote down for me. I appreciate them, but where I come at it from is a perspective of wanting to work with the land spirits, and connect to the land in which I'm living on and connecting to. I want to do it in a respectful way. So I work a lot with herbs and plants and trees, and I do a lot of magic that way. The way I find that I practice is very intuitive and much more based on what I feel and sense is right, rather than having a written charm. But I do think there is so much magic and potent wisdom to be extracted from some older tomes and texts and some lore as well. And so I think it's really, really important to kind of look at all of these areas. So looking at witchcraft from a historical context, looking at witchcraft from a Wiccan perspective, and then learning about Robert Cochrane. Cecil Williamson was a friend of Gerald Gardner at one point, and the two of them were working together at the museum for a while, and it's very, very interesting learning about this. And so you can see how the different practices, the different traditions sort of intersect and come together. And so I think it's really, really important, if you're interested in learning about traditional witchcraft, folk witchcraft, that not only do you connect to your land and the spirits of place, but you learn about the historical context of witchcraft, you learn about Wicca and its influences, and you learn about these different people who have influenced what we're doing now. And you come at it from different perspectives and keep your mind working as you read some of the texts. And I think that's the best way to begin and to approach this subject, because it's really diverse. It's almost a bigger project looking at traditional witchcraft and folk witchcraft than it is to, say, just decide to research Wicca because you are interested in Wicca, or you're interested in that, because there are some very, very good texts you can go to straight away, and then you can read different work by different authors. But I think eventually, even doing that, you'd want to learn about the historical context of witchcraft and want to learn more about traditional witchcraft as well. It just depends on what order you want to do things in, because there's no right way or wrong way. But I do think there's a lot to learn. So I think I've waffled enough. If there are any questions, anything that I haven't addressed fully that you'd like to ask me, do pop them in the comments box below. I'm going to get started and show you some of these books now. So the first book I'm going to recommend is not a specifically traditional witchcraft or folk witchcraft book, but it is one that I do think would be really, really valuable to anybody who is wanting to learn about this topic. And this is the book Witchcraft for Tomorrow by Doreen Valiente. I read this book several years ago now, and it is definitely one that I think is probably one of the most valuable books I've ever read. Doreen Valiente was a co-founder essentially of Wicca with Gerald Gardner. She wrote a lot of the beautiful poetry and rituals that are included in the Gardnerian Book of Shadows. Doreen Valiente is just a massive, massive part of the history of Wicca. This book goes into the depth of so many different practices that are not just related to Wicca. Just reading about the history between herself and Gerald, and with reference to Aleister Crowley as well, and also Cecil Williamson. It's a really, really interesting book to read, not just from a historical perspective and a contextual perspective, but also because there are some brilliant practices in here. And I just think that Doreen has a really, really excellent way of writing. I really thoroughly enjoyed this book. It was just a brilliant, brilliant book that I just think is absolutely worth a read. And it can be a fantastic jumping off point, I think, from whatever perspective you're coming to witchcraft from. Personally, I think this really, really helped me learning about more traditional forms of witchcraft, because I felt like I already had a basis of understanding around how Wicca was formed and around who some of the major players, the key people who were involved in, you know, the last century's worth of witchcraft and bringing it into the wider world again and making it well known. So I think this is a really, really valuable book. Another really, really great book to give context is The Witch's Bible by Janet and Stuart Farrar. This is a complete witch's handbook essentially, and originally it was separated into 2 or 3 books, I believe, but now it's all in one. This is a Wiccan book, but it gives a lot of historical context, a really great basis for learning about the different Sabbats and the wheel of the year. It's really, really interesting from a perspective of looking at the ethics of witchcraft and also looking at the different rituals that many Wiccans perform. Again, just a really, really excellent book to read for context. I first started reading this when I was a teenager. I picked it up because it looked like the right thing for me to be reading, and I was quickly very overwhelmed by the size of it and things that I wasn't understanding properly, and so I reread it, definitely made a lot of notes, and really, really believe that it's a really good book to read as a basis, a contextual basis. There are some things in it that did not sit so well with me because of the context and time in which it was written. However, I do believe that the authors had the best intentions when writing it. So even if some words or terms aren't the best for use in today's world, we know better now. I still think there's value in this book, and I think if you can read past that, there's still value to be gleaned from this book. And again, even though it's Wiccan, I think it gives a really good basis. So this is a good recommendation as well for me in general for witchcraft. Another witchcraft book that is not based in Wicca and doesn't really refer to Robert Cochrane's style of traditional witchcraft either. It kind of sits alone in a sort of esoteric space for me. It's very much more occult based. Is Paul Hewson's Mastering Witchcraft, A Practical Guide for Witches, Warlocks and Covens. I love this book. This book was absolutely fantastic. Paul Hewson gained a lot of his understanding from his work within the Golden Dawn, I believe, is where he learnt a lot of his practices. He refers a lot to ancient grimoires, to Enochian magic, etc. There's a lot of things in here that I didn't know about. A lot of different ways to work magic. There are some beautiful incenses, some fantastic dream spells, ways to work with different spirits and demons if that's what you're interested in. So whilst this is not Wicca, this is not traditional witchcraft that some might practice, it is a form of witchcraft that I think many would be really interested and intrigued to learn more about. This is much more of a traditional European approach to witchcraft in its purest form, rather than a sort of watered down kind of spirituality that I think many of us can sort of fall into buying books about because they're really pretty on Instagram. This goes a lot deeper than that. This references a lot of occult texts and a a lot of ancient grimoires, as I said. I think there's so much value and wisdom in this book, and I'm going to read it again. There's so much in here, working with different spirits, necromancy, just the ways of doing things. This book was so powerful for me, and a really, really great book to read for anyone who has only sort of read about Wicca. Perhaps, you know, it gives a different perspective, or anyone who's interested in learning about more occult practices, more ceremonial magics as well. So yeah, really brilliant book. Last year I read KELDEN's The Crooked Path. This is a fantastic introduction into traditional witchcraft. If you are starting from the very beginning, this is a brilliant book to start with. This explains a lot of it in a really, really fantastic, easy to understand, digestible, entertaining way. KELDEN is a really great storyteller, I believe. I think that they have a fantastic way of telling a story. I could listen to KELDEN speak all day on their YouTube channel. I really enjoy that, and the book is fantastic. It reads really easily. You could finish this in a day or two. You might not want to though. It's really, really enjoyable. This is one of the most enjoyable books I've read in the last few years. There's fantastic recipes in here from Sabbath bread. These are from the Black Book, which is KELDEN's own grimoire, Book of Shadows. It goes into rituals such as the housel, the treading the mill, the hallowing ritual. These are different rituals that primarily come from Robert Cochrane's teachings. And at the start, KELDEN does go into a little bit of historical context as well, which is fantastic. So there's a section here on Doreen Valiente, High Priestess of Gardener's Coven. For a time, Doreen Valiente was more on Robert Cochrane's wavelength of things rather than Gerald Gardner. So there's that as well, which is another reason why I think reading this is a fantastic place to start. But from like a basic traditional witchcraft, this is the introduction. Like, it's perfect. It's perfect for me because this book touches on everything. It gives you all the information you need to create your own broomstick. It gives you information about how to make a flying ointment, for instance, exercises for meeting ancestors, building up relationships with the land and with spirit guides, hedge crossing. This book has just brought everything that someone who's new to this path might want to learn about into one. Such a beautiful book, fantastic, great place to start. I would thoroughly recommend this book to anyone who is starting out. Whether or not you want to read this one first or this one, I think you're in a good place with, say you just started with these two books. It's a really, really good place to start. Personally, I would personally recommend this from the beginning, from the outset. If you have not read anything else around traditional witchcraft, definitely pick this book up. Another brilliant book, Gemma Gary's Traditional Witchcraft, A Cornish Book of Ways. Like this book is a fantastic place to start for traditional witchcraft. This is obviously focusing more on Cornish traditions. So this definitely goes into more folk witchcraft practices. There's a fairly long chapter called The Trade, which is about the different tools and workings that a practitioner of folk witchcraft, traditional witchcraft, might perform. I think this book is more suited to someone like me, perhaps, than this book, which, whilst it was a fantastic primer and of basic knowledge and understanding, KELDEN is based in the USA, whereas Gemma Gary is based in Cornwall. I live in Devon, so for me, this book is so perfect, and that it's got that West Country magic in there, and it's just exactly what I needed to read a long time ago. There's some beautiful incenses in here, some fantastic information about working with different animals of the craft, like the toad. There is a sort of tradition that runs through it. The cunning path, the land, the serpent, and becoming. Becoming is a kind of term in Cornwall for coming into trance, essentially, and going into that other world space. So there are so many different elements of lore that are very specifically local that are brought into this book that for me was so valuable. So if you are based in the USA, this may not be so resonant for you because of where you live, but if you're interested in traditional witchcraft, you want to read this book because there is so much value in this book, and there is so much of this magical lore in this part of the world. I'm so lucky to live here. I live in Devon. There is so much magic here. There are a lot of accounts as well of magical practitioners throughout the different centuries, 15th century, 16th century, accounts of different cunning folk, different witches, some of their practices, and you can learn more about that in Ronald Hutton's book as well. So this book is just a fantastic book, one that I will read again and reread again and reread again, and I really enjoyed it. I absolutely loved it. Honestly, one of the best books I've ever read, in all honesty. Cannot praise it enough. This is from Troy Books. This isn't so easy to get your hands on from Amazon, and if you are in the USA or in a different country, it might be a little bit more difficult to get your hands on it, but Troy Books probably do ship internationally. They might just be expensive. They are more expensive books than, say, one that you might buy on Amazon. So I think this was sort of $16.99. But they are such a great publisher for people who are interested in folk magic, traditional magic lore, anything around those areas. So this is just a golden, golden book. Probably my favourite, I would say, and definitely brilliant to start with if you're new. Another book by Gemma Gary is Silent as the Trees. This is a book I picked up several years ago and read because this is about Devonshire witchcraft, folklore and magic. So this goes into a lot more of the folklore and some of the tales that are written about things that were done. So one thing that I love here is there is a little story about Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould wrote a hymn, and he also obviously was a reverend. It happens to be my late grandmother's favourite hymn. My late grandmother read a passage from the Bible at my wedding. It turned out that the church we got married in was actually Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould's church, and it was like the absolute serendipity of that whole thing. I mean, it was just really magical. What it says here, Sabine Baring-Gould wrote in his Devonshire Characters and Strange Events of a remarkable case of magical healing he was personally aware of, which had been performed by a Tiverton White Witch known as Old Snow. He must have possessed a good reputation for the efficacy of his work, but as Baring-Gould explains, Old Snow did great business. So you can see how even the reverends, the Christian men of this time, Sabine Baring-Gould lived between 1834 and 1924. So when that was, I'm not entirely sure, but between the 19th and 20th centuries, essentially. And it's so interesting. I just think the way that this ties into our lives, because we live here, is fascinating. And there's so many magical places. Gemma Gary wraps them up into this incredibly entertaining book. At the end, there's a black book of Devonshire magic, where there are different charms and cures and healing recipes, etc. Charm for rheumatism, to charm a sty. So a lot of these are healing charms, etc., which is obviously what many practitioners did back then. So there's similar information here as in the Cornish Book of Ways, but Cornish Book of Ways I think is more practical, whereas this has got a lot of stories and lore in it, which is just fascinating for someone like me, someone who lives in Devon, in the West Country. So anyone who is also in England may wish to read this as well, especially, you know, if you want to plan a pilgrimage to Glastonbury or to Boscastle. You know, these are fantastic books for you to consume as well, because it's just so fascinating to learn about the lore of where we are. Whew, we're getting through these, I promise. Next up is Folk Witchcraft by Roger J. Horne. This is such a lovely little book. A really beautiful book as well. I believe this might actually be the older version. I think there's a newer version now, which I was gutted about. I love this book. I love the illustrations within and the font as well. I love how succinct this book is. At the start, Roger J. Horne explains that this is not going to be like another book where it tells you what to do. Instead, it gives you the tools to go and find out more yourself. So at the start, there's a fantastic section where Roger J. Horne talks about the different lore that they consider to be the most important lore for witches to read and to learn around. So including Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, Francesco Maria Gauzo's Compendium Maleficarum, which is different to the Malleus Maleficarum, Charles Godfrey Leland's Aradia, or The Gospel of the Witches, which I do think is one of those fantastic books for people who are interested in folk witchcraft to read. It's not one that I've included in this video because, as I said, I want to focus mostly on British. And I know I haven't because KELDEN is obviously based in the USA, but definitely reading Aradia was really, really profound. There's so much in there. So many beautiful evocations for Diana and beautiful prayers to the goddess, and some incredibly powerful workings as well. Culpeper's Complete Herbal, The Golden Bough, Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe. It gives you this fantastic basis of understanding so that you can go and do more research yourself, which I absolutely love. There's information here about the different celebrations that one might celebrate going into the 12th night, May's Eve, Candlemas, etc. Practices include things like learning the land. Then it goes into different rituals, so the tools that you may wish to use to lay the ring. The Sabbat rite, which is a bit like laying the compass or the compass round, is referred to in slightly different ways. There's information here about treading the mill as well, building up the rhythm, So there are lots of different practices in here, but it's a really, really nice small book to digest. And then there are some fantastic conjurations, songs, poems, workings. This is a charm for removal, which I thought was fantastic for removing illnesses. Again, just lots and lots of fantastic charms that you can learn and use, making a witch's ladder, etc. And I thought it was just a really, really lovely book to read and to work with, because it's got practical information as well as information to help you grow and learn more in your practice. So fantastic, fantastic book. Next up is Nigel J. Pearson's Treading the Mill, Workings in Traditional Witchcraft. I recently read this book and I loved it. I really like the way that Nigel writes. I think it's quite entertaining. There were some elements that I did think that some people might not agree with, but again, that comes down to it being a personal practice as well. And again, although it's traditional witchcraft, it's not the same all over. What I thought was really useful here is that Nigel provides a journey for readers to record and to guide themselves through to determine your own directional correspondences, because there are many different schools of thought about where your directional correspondences should be. Nigel talks about them that they need to be, you know, intuitive for you before you start working with them, and then to try them out that way, which I thought was really, really interesting. So then there's Hollowing the Compass, and then a second version. Then there's spellcrafts, different incenses that you can make. Then Entering the Twilight is very interesting because Nigel gets very, very real about visualization, which I really, really appreciate. Some really, really great nuggets of wisdom there, and definitely will help with your practice if you are interested in astral projection, hedge riding. Nigel refers to it as entering the twilight. In the Cornish Book of Ways, it is referred to as becoming, and there are probably subtle nuanced difference between all of these different ways that people refer to it, but as with many of the elements of spellcraft and magic and witchcraft, a lot of terms do relate to one another and include similar things, such as, you know, astral projection and hedge riding and path working. They may not be exactly the same, but they are similar. From that perspective, it's interesting because Nigel discusses it at length. Then it goes into more information about spirit work and working with the land as well, and it's just a fantastic read, a definite recommendation. I think it's a really, really good sort of modern book to read around traditional witchcraft, folk witchcraft, wherever you are. So again, this is published by Troy Books, I think with the help of Gemma Gary. It sort of is along those lines as well. Similar, but again, a different writer, a different practitioner's experiences, and a different way of coming at it. And Nigel Pearson is based in Suffolk, so again, a different region. So you're getting a glimpse into a different area of law and practice. So again, really, really interesting, really worth a read, definitely very, very valuable. A book that I think is a lovely book and I think really, really worth a read is A Spell in the Wild. This is one of those books that for a really long time I kind of thought, oh, that's just one of those pretty books. It is so much more than that. This is a book that I actually bought first on audiobook because I couldn't get to sleep and I wanted something that was going to be a little bit like storytelling, but around witchcraft. So this is A Spell in the Wild by Alice Tarbuck, A Year and 6 Centuries of Magic. So I wasn't sleeping very well and I wanted something to help relax me, I could listen to and just enjoy. So I picked up this book and I was listening to it slowly, and then my mum actually picked me up a copy of the book as well, which is really nice because there are some lovely spells in here. I think that whilst the cover is beautiful, I feel like it belies the wisdom and the magic that is inside, because this is a beautiful book. This is a really beautiful book inside and out, quite literally. There is so much magic in here. It touches on history, it touches on law, it touches on the different Sabbats because it takes you through a wheel of the year. I think there's so many beautiful aspects about Alice's personal practice and personal magic that is brought into this. Alice Tarbuck is a doctor, a writer, an editor, an academic based in Edinburgh. It says here she read English literature at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, received her doctorate from the University of Dundee. Her work on witchcraft has been featured in 404 Inc.'s Nasty Women and Dangerous Women project. She runs Toil and Trouble, or Witchcraft course. She's been invited to speak on witchcraft as feminist practice by Scottish Pen and by Freedom TV, and she's taught workshops for the National Library of Scotland, for the Scottish Poetry Library and further afield. And when she was born, a white wizard came to her house to bless her, and this, she suspects, is where the trouble started. I mean, that last sentence, that perfectly sums up the way she writes. It's with such magic and adventure and enthusiasm for exploring. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. I love the way that Alice has written this. Alice also narrates the audiobook as well, so if you wanted to do what I did and listen to it first, that's a really nice thing to do. But there are spells in it occasionally. So here there's a spell for hope in darkness, and it's for the midwinter to bring in the energy of the maiden mother crone. So you need your sacred space, a cushion, incense, 4 candles and matches, a scarf, etc. So what I feel about this book is that it's perfect for beginners, but it's also perfect for intermediate practitioners and advanced practitioners, because it's not just about spells. If you are completely new to witchcraft and you're not a witch, you can still get so much out of this from a entertainment perspective, from a historical perspective, from an information perspective about land and connecting to the land and ecosystems and the environment. It's fascinating. But also, if you are coming into witchcraft, it's not overwhelming in terms of all of these different tools you need and what you need to learn. It is just a really, really beautiful way to kind of introduce yourself into some of the rhythms of witchcraft and some of the rhythms of the cycle of nature and the wheel of the year. It's a really, really beautiful book. I can't say enough about this book, and I wish I'd read it sooner. So I think from a folk witchcraft perspective, it's lovely because there are some snippets of information about foraging and such that Alice includes. I think it's just a beautiful, beautiful book. Definitely worth a read. Next up, another Troy book is this small little book that I thought was going to be huge. Is by Graham King. This is the British Book of Spells and Charms. So again, this is taken from a number of different sources, from different lore, etc. So there are different spells and charms in here. So to cause love or regain a lover, buy 3 pennyworth of dragon's blood. Don't eat or drink between 11 and 12 at night as the clock strikes 12. And there's even some postcards in here that are included in the Museum of Witchcraft. And this says, on Halloween, look into the glass. Your future husband's face will pass. So again, all of these fantastic charms and spells that are part of our rich traditional history of witchcraft, and it's fascinating. And as someone who lives in England and is British, this to me is like gold dust. It was quite hard to get hold of this as well. This was a second-hand book, although it came looking fairly new. It was expensive. I did hunt for this book, but I'm so glad I have it because it's just beautiful to dip in and out of. Spells, Charms and Divinations for Love. Look at that beautiful pincushion at the Museum of Witchcraft. Fantastic little source book of information in this. Okay, so getting into some of the lore. This is a tome and a half, and no, I've not read this book. I have dipped in and out of this book to look for the different properties of different herbs. So this is Plant Lore, Legends and Lyrics, Embracing the Myths and Traditions, Volume 1 by Richard Folkard. This is a Forgotten Books reprint, and this was first published in 1884. Yeah, this again was published in 2012 by Forgotten Books, and it is essentially a scan. So you'll see the way that the pages have been scanned. Some of them look a little bit odd. It looks like basically someone's photocopied a book and put it in binding. Principal works referred to. So you've got here more lore. Literally, nuggets of gold are in these bibliographies at the back of the book. There are nuggets of gold in these bibliographies, so check out the bibliographies because you literally find more lore, more books. You just go down this rabbit hole. So this is fascinating because it also brings in fairy lore as well, because a lot of plants are associated with different fairies, etc. So there is some fairy lore sort of included in here. There's carrot, cashew, cassava, cassia tree. So many different plants in here. This is talking about Egyptian legends concerning the cedar. And so it's not just British, but there is a lot of British information in here, which is fantastic. But as I said, I've not read it cover to cover. There's a lot that I haven't read in here because I've dipped in and out to look at various different plants. But this is a tome that I think is going to be useful for the rest of my life until the end of days when learning about different plants. So there is a section on plant lore, legends and spells. Little snippets of information here about how you might want to use a plant magically. Plants antagonistic to witchcraft. The rowan, mountain ash or care tree has a great repute among country folk in the cure of ills arising from supernatural as well as natural causes. It's dreaded and shunned by evil spirits. The ash, in common with the rowan tree, possesses the property of resisting the attacks of witches, elves, etc. Vervain and St. John's wort carried about the person will prove a sure preservation against the wiles of Satan and the machinations and sorcery of witches. So it's very, very humorous. I think that that a lot of these charms that were used with plants were to kind of deflect witches' evil doings from the devil or witches. It is interesting, a lot of these people probably wouldn't have said that they do witchcraft, but it's these sort of magical charms that we now refer to. Obviously, there are references within traditional witchcraft to the horned god. Some refer to the devil, some just refer to the horned god. And the horned god is a figure that is related very much to Kanunos, or to many deities from different pantheons. Kanunos is a deity that for me very much resonates because of where I am, but again, gods like Pan, etc. These are sort of forest dwelling creatures, these gods of joy really, and sexual power and this energy that comes from the earth throughout the seasons. And I think you can see that reflected in the Wheel of the Year as well, and that even when you look at the Wiccan traditions and the rituals that they performed with the dramatizations of how the Holly King is defeated by the Oak King and then vice versa, and that keeps the wheel turning, and there's just this beautiful kind of cyclical nature to it all. There is this idea that the devil is not involved in witchcraft, and I think that that definitely reassures some people, and to a lot of people there is no devil in witchcraft. I personally don't work with a personified version of the devil because I work with the Morrigan specifically. I also work with Jesus, but I do feel a call to work with Kanunos, who is a figure that represents that horned god. A book I'd love to read actually is The Horned God by Jason Mankey, and that's a book that came out I think at the end of last year. I've not read it and I would like to. I think I'd very much get a lot of information from that book and really help to build a practice with Kanunos, or a horned god. So it is interesting to me, but there is that misconception that the devil is not involved in witchcraft, and I think that it is something that was said a lot to reassure family members or friends of people who find out that they're practicing witchcraft, because they don't want people to think that they're doing evil magics, the work of Satan or the devil. But there are people who do work with Satan or Lucifer or the devil. They are different figures to those different people. As Luciferianism or Satanism, I don't know too much about it other than what I've learned and read. It's not a path that I follow, but I fully respect anyone who follows it, and I absolutely embrace the horned god within the practice that I work and within the traditions that I'm reading about. It's very important to me to get to know that aspect of a deity in my practice, so that's something that I am moving towards learning more about. So little segue there. This is a long video. If you're still here, you're a trooper. So I mentioned earlier Culpeper's Complete Herbal by Nicholas Culpeper. This is the illustrated version. I've wanted to pick this up for years and I just never have. I had it on my list and I picked this up in Glastonbury when I last went. And this is a beautiful version because it has a really beautiful sort of textbook layout and these fantastic illustrations, very easy to read and understand. From a herbalism perspective, because I am very much interested in taking a herbalism course because I work with a lot of herbs in my practice, I think this is just a brilliant thing to have. I actually learned recently, Sky House Herbs is run by the wife of Achita Baba, who is an astrologer on YouTube. I love their channels, I will link them below. They recently did a live series with different herbalists. I actually learned there that this is one of the oldest books that's never been out of print other than the Bible, I think. So this is just an incredible resource, and I can't believe I haven't had it in my library until recently. But what I will say is I would love to do a video about books I'd recommend for people who are interested in green witchcraft and working with plants, working with herbs in their practice more, and this would definitely be included in there. But from a law perspective, for folk witchcraft, this is a absolute must, I think. And yeah, I can't believe I lasted so long. I think it's because I've got other books about herbs. I managed not to need this, but this is just a fantastic book. So I would definitely recommend this. Next up, some more lore. This is the Compendium Maleficarum, which was mentioned in Roger J. Horne's book Folk Witchcraft. This is different to the Malefice Maleficarum, which is slightly more famous, I believe. This is by Francesco Maria Gauso and edited by Montague Summers, collected in 3 books from many sources by brother Francesco Maria Gauso. And this has value to it because we can literally glean a lot of information about the ways in which charms and magic were performed in the 16th century. So this was written in 1608, so 16th, 17th century, of the witch's pact with the devil argument. So the pact formed between a witch and the devil may be either expressed or tacit. The expressed pact consists of a solemn vow of fidelity and homage made in the presence of witnesses to the devil visibly present in some bodily form. Then after the argument you have some examples. Remy relates that a youth named Theodore Malliot desired in marriage a maiden of very wealthy family, but was quite without hope of winning her, since he was poor and of humble birth, and his family was engaged in commerce, which was then despised as ignoble. Therefore he could see no honourable means of declaring his love. And so the story goes on. Essentially what the book is designed to do is to scare people and to condemn witches. So it's not exactly a fun thing to be reading about, but again, if you wanted to read Ronald Hutton's Witch, it's similar kinds of information that you're going to be absorbing, and it's not always comfortable, but I feel that it's part of my position as a witch to explore these areas and to do so humbly and to do so stepping into the discomfort of it and the shadow of it. And you know, if anyone doesn't want to do that, then I don't think that is a prerequisite at all, and it's within your own time. You know, it took me a long time to decide to read this kind of information. But essentially where this differs from the Malleus Maleficarum is, along with the arguments, there are examples of the arguments within actual historical records. So historical records of people doing certain things and performing certain rites and performing certain magics that can be really, really useful for us as modern witches to learn and know about and understand. It's essentially sort of the primary source. If you read a book like this is like a secondary source because it's got all of the information there, whereas this is primary source. You know, this is something that you might want to read, dip in and out of, as I have done. So far, I've not read all of this book. I've dipped in and out of it and found value in it, but this is something that might be a little bit more digestible in that way and less about the Maleficarum side of things, which may not be something that you may want to explore right now, but I think eventually it's something that you are going to be wanting to look into, and this is something that I would recommend. This was about £7 on Amazon, so it was not expensive, just a really, really good source book to have. So now on to some books that I have not read yet. And they are books that I will read cover to cover, but I haven't not got round to it. But these are books that are next up for me. So Operative Witchcraft by Nigel Pennick. I've heard great things about this. This is about spellwork and herbcraft in the British Isles. So again, exactly where I am is exactly about traditional witchcraft, essentially. It says, highlighting unique English traditions, Pennick explores fetches and witches' familiars, animal magic, and the forms of witchcraft practiced by rural tradespeople such as blacksmiths, herbalists, and artisans to enhance their professional work and compel others to do their bidding, both man and beast. And this sounds like a fantastic book to me. In this practical guide, Nigel Pennick takes the reader on a journey through the practice of operative witchcraft in the British Isles from the Middle Ages and the Elizabethan era to the decriminalisation of witchcraft in the 1950s and its practice today. Michael Moynihan, co-author of Lords of Chaos and co-editor of the journal TYR Myth, Culture and Tradition, says that operative witchcraft is an unromanticised, warts and all survey of the real history and lore of witchcraft in the author's native England and elsewhere. One could not ask for a more knowledgeable and sympathetic guide through these shadow-filled realms than Nigel Pennick. So whilst I haven't read this yet, if perhaps reading something like this is a little bit overwhelming or perhaps not something you want to read yet, then potentially this could be a good place to start because it sounds like it's going to go into some of those less than pleasant points and aspects. So here we go, a carved head about 2 inches long found in a churchyard in Hertfordshire. So I grew up in Bedfordshire, which is a county over from Hertfordshire, and there was actually quite a lot of witchcraft lore and a lot of stories that came from Bedfordshire as well. So I think one day I would love to get a book about witchcraft in Bedfordshire. If anyone knows of any books that are written about Bedfordshire specifically, or like East Anglia, that kind of area around the witchcraft practices, I would be really interested in reading that. But I think this is going to be a great place for me to move into next. So this is the next one on my list in terms of reading around folk and traditional witchcraft. Witchfinders, 17th century English tragedy by Malcolm Gaskill. I've had this book since I saw Stella Rain Dancer discuss this on their channel, and I have not yet read it. But I have a story about this because I got chills. So in my previous job, I was a writer, a journalist, and I was given a job to write about a place that I'd never heard of, and the town is Manningtree in Essex. I didn't know much about Manningtree at all. No bells started ringing until I started researching a little bit about Manningtree. And Manningtree was literally the site of one of the most brutal witch hunts in England. So in 1645, the Civil War had exacted a terrible toll upon England. Disease was rife, apocalyptic omens appeared in the skies, and idolaters were detected in every shire. In a remote corner of Essex, two obscure gentlemen began interrogating women suspected of witchcraft, triggering the most brutal witch hunt in English history. Witchfinders is a spellbinding study of how Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, and John Stern extended their campaign across East Anglia, driven by godly zeal. Exploiting the anxiety and lawlessness of the times and cheered on by ordinary folk, they extracted confessions of satanic pacts, resulting in scores of executions. Now, when the penny dropped, when I was working on that piece, I literally ran to the bookcase with like shivers and pulled this out, and I was like, oh my gosh, I need to read this. And I realized what it was. It was synchronicity, because I was being called to work on this. I was being called to learn about this, and whilst I've not read this yet, just reading the Compendium Maleficarum, reading Around the Law, reading Ronald Hutton's Witch, it's getting me closer to learning about some of the brutalities of the witch hunt in general. And it's something, again, that isn't discussed so much these days in our circles, and I think we should discuss it more. And the reclaiming of the word witch, etc., is something I feel really, really passionate about. And the witch wound as well, which I'm not entirely sure of the origins of that phrase. I think it potentially was Lisa Lister in the book Witch, which I have not read and I don't plan to read because of some of the ways that some topics are dealt with in that book. It's not something that I would like to read. However, I understand the idea of a witch wound because I feel it. It's like I feel it here and in my gut, and it's like I feel this thread through me back through my lifetimes, and I feel this kind of understanding about it, and it's almost like I've been pushing it away for many, many years, and now it just gets me feeling kind of sick, and it hurts my heart, and it makes me feel sick. It feels like a hook in my gut. I have to learn about it, and I think that that's what this was. This assignment that I had at work was literally, it was synchronistic because it's work that I had to do. And so I wrote this piece about Manningtree, and so much of the history of that town is literally about Matthew Hopkins and the terror that he reigned over this town and over the people in this town. And this is definitely a book I need to read this year before the year is out, because I think this is going to be extremely powerful for me and definitely really, really valuable, you know, whilst I'm learning more and more about traditional witchcraft and folk witchcraft. And I think that the journey of being a witch for me is a lot about reclaiming that word, but also healing those wounds, healing those witch wounds that go way back, and looking at the word again and how it feels inside my body, etc. So powerful, powerful work to be done there for me. So this is another book I've got to read. And another book that I have that I picked up secondhand a few years ago and I've still not read it is Christina Hole's Witchcraft in England. Now, some of you may have already read this because I think it's quite a famous book. This goes into some of the Maleficium. This book, again, is a historical tome. It says witchcraft was a practice in England from time immemorial. Pagan magic was denounced by the medieval church, but England escaped the Continental Inquisition. It was not until the reign of Queen Elizabeth I that serious witch hunting began. It was to last with all the ruthless trappings of informing, searching, swimming, prosecutions and hanging for over 150 years. Few people know more about English witchcraft than Christina Hole, who set the more sensational stories in a balanced context. Besides highlighting the famous individuals such as Elizabeth Francis with her spotted cat, Old Chattocks, and Dr. Dee, she examines the sort of people who became involved in witchcraft, including white witches, prophets and astrologers, the arts they practiced, the familiars they used, the everyday needs they satisfied, and the fear and hatred they aroused. And she describes too the violent persecution of the 17th century and the subsequent gradual decline of the belief in witchcraft. But the Act of 1736, which swept away the penal laws against witchcraft, sorcery, enchantment, or conjuration, could not eradicate popular beliefs and practices. Even now, traces of the old faith flourish in our everyday superstitions and in revived rituals and covens, but the fear and hatred surrounding witchcraft have vanished. Christina Hole is one of the most experienced and knowledgeable writers on all aspects of English folklore. Her many works include English traditional customs, haunted England, and English folklore. and lively illustrations were specially drawn by Mervyn Peake for the book's first edition. 27 illustrations in here by Mervyn Peake. And here we go, here is Hopkins himself. An illustration of Hopkins with a suspected witch. So again, this is more work for the witch within me. And I know what I've got to do, it's just, there are so many books to read and not enough time. But I have spent a good proportion of this last year reading some folk witchcraft and traditional witchcraft books, and I would absolutely recommend these books to you if you are interested in learning more about traditional witchcraft or folk witchcraft practices, or even just working with the land in general. I think that there are so many little rabbit holes within these topics that you are going to want to follow and go down, and that's completely natural. And as I said as well at the beginning, I am not an expert on any of these topics. I am a person who is a witch who has practiced sort of eclectically for most of my life since I was 11. I have essentially brought together the knowledge that I have from reading many different books by many different authors, and I think that folk witchcraft, traditional witchcraft, is the practice that sort of resonates the most for me because I work in a very intuitive way. I work a lot with the land, I work on the astral, and I work a lot with herbs as well in my practice. So it feels to me like it resonates the most. I think some practices that don't so much resonate are some of the very prescriptive rituals that are listed, that I think some of them come from Robert Cochrane. I haven't read any of his letters, and that's something that I would like to do. But essentially this is sort of where I am at in my journey of learning about traditional witchcraft and folk witchcraft. And if you have been practicing folk witchcraft and traditional witchcraft for much longer than I have, and you think I've missed anything out, please leave it below. You know, I want this community to be friendly and open to one another. I am not an authority on this. I am one witch, one practitioner, and this is some of the stuff that I've been learning about the last few years or so, some of the books that I've read in the last few years, and consciously been very, very interested to read about in this last year. I've very much been wanting to just read more and more and more about traditional witchcraft and folk witchcraft, and that's an element of the journey that I've been on in this past year, I'd say. So if you would like to add anything below, please do. This is a friendly, open, safe space, so please do feel free to do that. If you've had any experiences at all that you'd like to share, if you have any questions or anything that you'd like me to confirm if I wasn't clear on anything, or you'd like me to go into further depth about anything, do let me know. If you have any ideas that come to you whilst watching this about videos you'd like me to make, let me know below as well. Be happy to do that. This has been a really, really great video to film. I'm very passionate about this topic, very interested in this topic, and my learning is not stopping. I'm a forever student. I'm always learning, I'm always reading, I'm always growing, always developing, and always evolving my practice. Just as nothing remains the same, I am always growing and evolving. And again, do not take what I say here as gospel. Go elsewhere, watch other content creators, read books by other people, and look at them through that lens of critical thinking that I was discussing at the start of this video. I think one of the best ways to look at learning when you're a witch is to look through that critical lens, and having that ability to think critically about the work that you're reading is really, really valuable as a witch. Definitely when it comes to learning about historical context and learning about the persecution of witches, really, really valuable to be able to look through that critical lens and to be able to extract the knowledge, the information that is there for us. If you have any other book recommendations, do leave them below. There are some other books I've not read yet that I'm aware of and I'd like to read, especially some brilliant new books coming out with Troy Books. So check out Troy Books online. I will leave a link to them below. There are loads and loads of fantastic traditional witchcraft and folk witchcraft books from Troy Publishing, so definitely look at that website. So I have waffled long enough. If you are still here, that's amazing. Thank you so much. I really hope that this has been valuable to you. If the video was valuable, useful in any way or helpful, then please do like the video. Leave me a comment below if you'd like to. Click the thumbs up button, share it with anyone who is also into witchcraft, magic, or who you think would be interested in these topics. Also, if you'd like to see more from me along the lines of witchcraft, tarot, magic, spirituality, and occult, then do think about subscribing. And when you subscribe, don't forget to hit that little bell notification, because that's how YouTube is going to let you know when I create and upload videos like this. So with all that said, thank you again so much for joining me. I hope you stay well and safe, and I look forward to seeing you in another video really soon. Take care. Bye. Mwah.